He knows that his lover has mysteriously left him, and we find him in great pain, but he doesn't yet know why.
For nearly 4 decades, Colin Firth embodied something the world desperately wanted to believe in: the possibility of being a decent man. Not a rebel, not a provocateur, just fundamentally good. Reserved, thoughtful, a man who chose meaningful relationships over tabloid spectacle, who built his entire image around the very idea of emotional depth and romantic integrity. He was the King's Speech, the Pride and Prejudice dream, the British gentleman who restored faith in masculinity itself. But at 65 years old, Colin Firth represents something far more complicated and heartbreaking. The story of what happens when the man behind the image is revealed to be profoundly human, flawed, vulnerable, and devastatingly easy to manipulate. This is the story of how a carefully constructed identity collapsed not because of scandal, but because of something far more tragic: complicity without intention, and betrayal he helped enable. But before we understand how this happened, stay with us, because the full picture of Colin Firth's fall is far more complex and deeply sad than the headlines ever captured. Colin Firth was born into intellectual privilege. His father, a university professor; his mother, a professor of literature. His household filled with books, debate, and the kind of emotional restraint that passes for sophistication in British academic circles. He was the kind of child who learned early that feelings were something you managed, not expressed. He became an actor not despite this emotionless training, but because of it. He understood how to construct a persona, how to contain complexity behind a composed exterior. By the 1980s, Firth was that actor everyone whispered about. Not handsome in the conventional sense. His face carried a questioning quality, a gentleness that felt almost apologetic. He specialized in roles that required internal struggle. Men trapped between duty and desire, between who they were expected to be and who they actually were. When he played Mr. Darcy in the BBC adaptation of Pride and Prejudice in 1995, something shifted. He became an archetype, a standard by which romantic male beauty would be measured for a generation. Not because he was classically handsome, but because he represented something more. He seemed to understand women. He seemed like he would listen. The roles that followed reinforced this image. The romantic lead in Mamma Mia. The gentle genius in The King's Speech. The conflicted father in Mamma Mia. Here we go again. He won an Academy Award for Best Actor in 2011 for The King's Speech, standing at the podium at age 50, at the absolute peak of his powers, his career trajectory pointing only upward. By any objective measure, Colin Firth had become what every actor dreams of becoming: a legend while still alive. But there was something unsettling about his personal life, even at the height of his fame. He remained unmarried until his 40s. He seemed uncomfortable with attention. In interviews, he gave nothing away, deflecting with British humor, pivoting with charm, always maintaining the boundary between the public Colin Firth and whoever existed privately. There was something almost desperate in how carefully he protected his interior life. Then, in 1997, he met Livia Giagioli. She was everything he was not: expressive, passionate, an artist and activist from Italy with a son from a previous relationship. She was, by all accounts, a woman who demanded to be known. And Colin, starved for genuine connection beneath the carefully maintained facade, gave her everything. He accommodated her constantly. He adopted her son. He stepped away from leading roles to support her artistic vision. He funded her projects. He became, by all accounts, not the distant intellectual of his childhood, but something he had always wanted to be: essential to someone who seemed to genuinely need him. For nearly 20 years, the relationship appeared to be his greatest role. The devoted husband and stepfather, finally able to express the emotional depth his career had only allowed him to simulate. By 2014, Firth had begun to retreat from Hollywood. He was in his 50s, comfortable with his legacy, less interested in the machinery of celebrity. He and Livia were, by all external measures, the marriage everyone envied, the kind of partnership that made you believe in commitment, in the possibility of real love amid the artificiality of the entertainment industry. The first sign that something was wrong arrived quietly, almost apologetically, which should have been the tell. In March 2018, Livia accused Marco Brancaccia, a childhood friend, of stalking her. It was the kind of accusation that feels immediately credible when made by a woman you believe to be truthful. And Colin believed. He publicly supported his wife. He stood beside her in this accusation. He allowed his name, his reputation, his Oscar-winning credibility to become entangled with the narrative. His wife was being harassed, and the stalker needed to be exposed. Marco Brancacchia was arrested. His life fractured. He faced charges. The Italian press covered it with the intensity scandal deserves. And Colin Firth, by simply standing beside his wife, had inadvertently become complicit in what appeared to be justice. But then in 2019, something shifted. The investigation deepened. The evidence changed direction. What emerged was devastating in its simplicity. Livia had not been stalked. She had been having an affair with Marco during a separation from Colin. When the affair ended and Marco moved on, Livia had accused him of stalking to cover up the infidelity. Colin had unwittingly become a tool in his wife's narrative. His reputation, his credibility, his very belief in her had been weaponized against an innocent man. The realization hit like a physical blow. Colin Firth, the man who had built his entire public identity around emotional integrity and moral clarity, had helped destroy an innocent person's reputation. Not out of cruelty, but out of love. Out of the very vulnerability that had made him such a compelling actor. His willingness to believe in people he loved, his refusal to doubt them even when doubt was warranted. The marriage that had appeared so perfectly constructed began to visibly collapse. Separated in 2019, divorced by 2020. At 58 years old, Colin Firth was rebuilding his life and rebuilding his sense of self. But what happened next? The realization he would have to publicly acknowledge his own unwitting role in destroying an innocent man's life changed everything about how he would see himself forever. The public reckoning arrived slowly, the way the worst truths do. By early 2019, the Italian courts had begun examining the accusations more carefully. Evidence emerged. Text messages. Witness statements. The narrative that had seemed so clear in 2018 began to fracture. By mid-2019, the reality was undeniable. Marco Brancacchia had been falsely accused. He was the victim of his own public destruction, and Colin Firth, Oscar winner, romantic ideal, the embodiment of British integrity, had been the unwitting instrument of that destruction. The media coverage in Italy was intense and unforgiving. But what made the situation uniquely tragic was not the scandal itself. Celebrity marriages end, accusations are sometimes false. These are the ordinary tragedies of human connection. What was heartbreaking was Colin's position. He could not simply walk away from the accusation and move forward. To do so would be to abandon his wife publicly. But to remain silent was to allow an innocent man's destroyed reputation to remain in ruins. The emotional and legal complexity was suffocating. Colin Firth had to confront the fact that his greatest strength as a person, his capacity to believe in people he loved, his willingness to be vulnerable enough to trust, had been weaponized. Not intentionally by Livia as some calculated strategy, but through her own damage, her own need to cover up her infidelity with an accusation that would be believed precisely because she was married to someone whose credibility was unquestionable. In interviews during this period, Colin's usual composure fractured visibly. He was photographed looking exhausted, aged beyond his years, the weight of unwitting complicity showing in his face. He had to publicly walk back his support for his wife's accusations while simultaneously managing the collapse of his marriage. He had to acknowledge that he had believed someone he loved so completely that he hadn't questioned them, and that this capacity for belief had caused real harm to a real person. The timing made everything worse. This was 2019, the era of #MeToo, when accusations of harassment and assault were finally being taken seriously, when women's experiences were finally being centered in a way they never had been before. And into this moment came a story where the accusation was false, where the woman was the liar, where the man was the victim, and where the woman was not a calculating villain, but a person whose own infidelity and shame had driven her to destroy someone else's reputation to protect her own. Colin Firth could not claim victimhood. He was complicit even if unintentionally. He could not blame his wife publicly without looking like he was undermining the very #MeToo movement that had finally given voice to real survivors. He was caught in an impossible position, morally implicated, publicly exposed, and utterly unable to control the narrative in a way his entire career had trained him to do. By the end of 2019, the marriage was formally over. The couple separated, and within months the divorce proceedings began. At 59 years old, Colin Firth faced something he had never had to face before: genuine irrelevance. Not the loss of roles, that would come later, but the loss of the identity that had sustained him since childhood. The idea that he was the good man, the trustworthy one, the repository of integrity in an industry built on illusion. The realization must have been suffocating. He had spent 59 years perfecting the performance of being good, only to discover that goodness and the performance of goodness are not the same thing. He had believed so completely in his own persona that he had not noticed how thin it had become, how easily it could be pierced by someone who understood him well enough to exploit his very vulnerabilities. But the tragedy of Colin Firth is not simply the story of a failed marriage or a false accusation. It reveals something far more systematic about the specific way that emotionally guarded men become vulnerable to manipulation. Pattern 1. The intellectual as emotional amateur. Colin was trained from childhood to treat emotions as things to be managed intellectually rather than felt authentically. When he met Livia, someone whose life was entirely built on authentic emotional expression, he was intoxicated by the permission she seemed to give him to finally feel. This meant he evaluated emotional claims through an intellectual framework. If Livia said she was being stalked, he analyzed the claim rationally and determined it must be true because the person making the claim was someone he loved. He did not have the emotional literacy to recognize that love and truth are not the same thing. Pattern 2. The powerful man made powerless. For decades, Colin had controlled his public image absolutely. Every interview, every red carpet, every role was a calculated decision. But marriage to someone like Livia meant surrendering that control. He could not control her narrative, her choices, her decisions. This surrender felt like finally being authentic, but what it actually was the creation of a situation where his need for authenticity overrode his judgment. Pattern 3. The belief in redemption through love. Colin's entire filmography is built on the idea that love transforms people, that connection heals damage, that vulnerability between two people creates safety. He believed this so completely that he could not imagine his wife would weaponize his trust against him. He could not imagine that someone would lie precisely because they knew he would believe them. Pattern 4. The performance of goodness as substitute for goodness. The most devastating realization is that Colin had spent so many decades performing emotional authenticity that he may not have developed genuine discernment about actual emotional situations. He knew how to convincingly portray a good man, but actual goodness requires judgment, skepticism, and the willingness to doubt people you love. But the most devastating part of Colin Firth's story is what it revealed about the cost of maintaining a persona for an entire lifetime, and what happened when that persona finally cracked. By 2020, something had shifted in Colin Firth that went beyond the end of a marriage. He was facing a crisis of identity so profound that it threatened to erase the man he had constructed over 5 decades. The professional consequences began to materialize. Oscar-winning roles evaporated. The kinds of scripts that had come automatically throughout his 50s suddenly dried up. At 60, actors are often considered finished by Hollywood, but actors with the kind of reputation Colin had built could usually find dignified work in quality productions. That began to disappear. He took roles in action films and streaming productions beneath his caliber. He worked more in theater, which paid less and received less attention. The career trajectory that had seemed to point only upward had suddenly reversed. But the professional decline was almost secondary to the personal crisis. Colin was, for the first time in his adult life, alone, not temporarily alone. He had spent separated periods between relationships before, but fundamentally alone, stripped of the role that had given him the most stable identity: husband and stepfather. These were the roles that had allowed him to finally feel needed, to finally matter in a way that acting alone could never provide. Dating as a 60-year-old man who had been deeply betrayed by the person he trusted most was a specific kind of torment. He could not simply move forward with an open heart. His heart had been wounded by the very vulnerability he had cultivated so carefully. He found himself emotionally unavailable, trapped behind walls that his marriage was supposed to have demolished, but which were now reinforced by the trauma of unwitting complicity. Friends and colleagues from this period describe a man who had become almost unrecognizable. The easy charm, the gentle humor, the capacity to make people feel understood. All of it seemed to have been withdrawn, pulled back into wherever he kept the parts of himself that were not performing. He had given everything to a relationship that turned out to be built on a lie told by the one person he most wanted to believe in. The psychological cost of that realization was incalculable. What makes this tragedy distinct from the ordinary heartbreak of divorce is that Colin could not simply grieve the loss of his marriage. He had to simultaneously grieve the loss of his own self-image as someone who was good, who was trustworthy, who had chosen well. He had to carry the weight of knowing that his very goodness, his belief in his wife, his refusal to doubt her, had destroyed another person's life. He was not a villain, but he was not innocent either. He was complicit in a way that would haunt him. By 2023, at age 63, Colin Firth had withdrawn almost entirely from public life. He did indie films that no one saw, theater productions that ran in London to audiences of 200 people, work that felt less like a career and more like an extended retreat. The man who had once embodied the possibility of being loved by millions had become someone who seemed to distrust being loved at all. At 65 years old, Colin Firth exists in a state that might be called acceptance rather than recovery. He is no longer fighting the collapse. He is learning to live within it. The career has stabilized into something quieter, something smaller than it was, but somehow more honest. He is doing indie films directed by artists who understand what he is capable of, projects that demand genuine vulnerability rather than the performance of vulnerability. He is doing theater, real theater, the kind where you perform the same role 8 times a week and have nowhere to hide. He is teaching occasionally, sharing the technical skills of his craft with younger actors who are still in the phase of their careers where they believe that performance and authenticity are separable. He has accepted that the Oscar-winning roles, the leading man parts, the projects that come with the machinery of major studios and premieres and global attention, these are likely finished. At 65, after the specific kind of public trauma he endured, the industry's willingness to reinvest in him has limits. But there is something almost peaceful in this acceptance. He has stopped fighting for relevance and has instead begun to participate in work that simply interests him. His personal life remains largely private, which is both a return to form and a protective measure. He is not married. He is not in a public relationship. Friends describe him as someone who seems to have made peace with solitude, though whether that is genuine peace or a sophisticated performance of peace is impossible to know. Given everything we know about Colin Firth, it may be both simultaneously. What is clear is that he has not recovered in the way recovery is usually framed. He has not moved on to a new marriage or a romantic partnership that validates the theory that betrayal can be overcome through connection with someone new. He has instead moved into a kind of intentional quietness, a withdrawal from the categories of life, famous husband, stepfather, leading man, that once defined him. He is rebuilding an identity stripped of the roles that once sustained him, and doing so with something that looks like dignity and resignation. The realization that may haunt him most is the one he cannot escape. His very capacity for empathy, his willingness to believe in people, his refusal to doubt those he loved. These were his most admirable qualities. And these same qualities made him catastrophically vulnerable to someone who understood how to manipulate them. There is no way to be the kind of person Colin Firth wanted to be without carrying the specific risk that led to his downfall. So here is what his story reveals about all of us. The gap between who we perform and who we actually are is not a problem to be solved. It is a permanent condition of being human. And sometimes, the very qualities we most admire in ourselves are the ones that make us most dangerous to those around us, without our ever intending harm. Colin Firth spent 50 years perfecting the performance of being good. And the tragedy is not that the performance was false. It was not. He was genuinely good, genuinely thoughtful, genuinely capable of deep connection. The tragedy is that being a good person does not protect you from the people you love. It does not make you immune to manipulation. It does not guarantee that your trust will be honored. That is the legacy of Colin Firth at 65. A man who gave everything to the idea of being worthy of love, only to discover that being worthy and being safe are not the same thing. A man who supported someone he trusted and became complicit in destroying someone innocent. A man who has now spent years rebuilding an identity from the rubble of his own shattered assumptions. The question he invites us to sit with is this: do you believe that Colin Firth could have been the good man he wanted to be without the specific vulnerability that nearly destroyed him? Is it possible to trust people you love while simultaneously protecting yourself from the possibility that they might betray that trust? Or is genuine love always an act of dangerous faith that offers no guarantee except the possibility of heartbreak? These are not small questions. They are the questions that separate the people who dare to be authentically vulnerable from those who protect themselves through permanent skepticism. Colin Firth's story is both a warning and an invitation. A warning about the costs of genuine connection, and an invitation to consider whether a life lived behind walls is actually safer or simply quieter. This is the tragedy of Colin Firth. Not that his marriage ended, but that his capacity to believe ended with it. At 65, he is still living with the weight of that loss. What do you think? Is it possible to open your heart to the people you love while still protecting yourself from being destroyed by them? Or is complete vulnerability always a risk that ends in tragedy? Do you believe Colin Firth could have made different choices, or was he trapped by his own nature, the very nature that made him so compelling to watch? Share your honest thoughts in the comments below, because this conversation truly belongs to all of us. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the people whose public image mask